Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the edge of the Sahara Desert just as the first light of dawn breaks over the horizon. The air is cool against your skin, carrying the scent of sand and stone, and something infinitely older. Before you, rising from the earth like a prayer made manifest, stand the pyramids of Giza. They catch the morning sun and seem to glow from within, as if remembering the hands that built them, the voices that echoed across this same sand thousands of years ago. But what if those voices spoke a language older than hieroglyphs? What if the hands that guided their construction belonged not to pharaohs alone, but to beings who walked this earth before Egypt even had a name? Tonight, we embark on a journey that will take us across continents and millennia, connecting two of the ancient world's most powerful civilizations through a thread of mythology, archaeology, and tantalizing mystery. We will ask a question that has haunted researchers, mystics, and historians for generations. What if the gods of Egypt, those magnificent beings with their animal heads and cosmic powers, were not purely Egyptian at all? What if they were the descendants, the children, the legacy of an even older pantheon? What if the Egyptian gods were the descendants of the Anunnaki? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The question hangs in the air like incense smoke in a temple. To answer it, we must first understand who the players are in this cosmic drama. We must look backward, past the splendour of the New Kingdom, past the majesty of the Old Kingdom pyramids, past even the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, to a land between two rivers where the first cities rose from the dust and the first words were pressed into clay. Mesopotamia. The Greeks called it this, meaning the land between rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. But to those who lived there, it was simply home, the cradle where civilization first opened its eyes and took its first stumbling steps towards something greater. Here, in what is now Iraq, the Sumerians established city-states around 4500 BCE, each centered on a massive stepped pyramid called a ziggurat, each devoted to the worship of powerful beings they called the Anunnaki. The word itself carries weight. Anunnaki. In the ancient Sumerian language, it can be translated as princely offspring or those of royal blood. These were not minor spirits or nature elementals. These were the supreme deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the descendants of An, the god of the heavens, and Keith, the goddess of the earth. Mainstream scholarship identifies them as the principal gods who decreed the fates of humanity, who established civilization, who taught the arts of writing and agriculture and law. The oldest texts we have, dating back to around 2100 BCE during the third dynasty of Ur, name them explicitly, and the sky god distant and supreme. Enlil, the god of air and wind, who separated heaven from earth and carried away the earth while his father took the sky. Enki, also known as Ea, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and creation, who dwelt in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, Nanna, the moon god, Utu, the sun god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war. These were beings of immense power, depicted in cylinder seals and bas-reliefs with horned crowns symbolizing their divinity, often shown descending from the heavens or emerging from doorways flanked by winged guardians. The texts describe them not as abstract forces, but as personalities, with rivalries and alliances, with families and conflicts. They met in divine councils to decide the fates of both gods and humans. They walked among mortals in the earliest days, according to the legends, teaching and guiding the development of civilization itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, these ancient texts preserve stories of a time when the line between the divine and the mortal was thinner, when gods could be encountered, placated, angered, when they could flood the world or save a righteous man, when they could create humanity itself to serve as workers for their divine enterprises. This is the established academic understanding. The Anunnaki were the gods of Sumer, later adopted and adapted by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. They represent humanity's early attempts to understand and personify the forces that governed their world, from the life-giving rivers to the destructive storms, from the cycles of agriculture to the mysteries of death. But there is another interpretation, one that has captured imaginations and sparked fierce debate since it was first popularized in the 70s, This alternative view sees the Anunnaki not as mythological constructs, but as historical visitors. In this telling, they were not gods, but extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago from a distant planet, who genetically engineered Homo sapiens to serve as a labour force, who built or inspired the great monuments of the ancient world, and whose legacy echoes through every creation myth and pantheon that followed. This theory, most famously articulated by Zecharia Sitchin in his groundbreaking 1976 book The 12th Planet, remains deeply controversial. Academic scholars dismiss it almost universally, pointing to flawed translations, selective readings of ancient texts, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how mythology functions. Yet millions have found in Sitchin's work a compelling narrative that seems to answer age-old questions about human origins, ancient achievements, and the persistent similarities between cultures that supposedly never contacted one another. Whether you view the Anunnaki as gods or visitors, or simply as symbolic representations of natural forces, one thing is certain: their influence did not remain confined to the land between two rivers. Trade routes, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange ensured that ideas flowed like water across the ancient Near East, and one of the greatest civilizations to rise in that ancient world stood ready to receive those ideas, to absorb them, to transform them into something uniquely its own. That civilization was Egypt. You stand now not in Mesopotamia, but on the banks of the Nile River, that liquid highway that gave birth to one of history's most enduring cultures. The year is approximately 3100 BCE. The air is heavy with anticipation. Something momentous is about to happen, a unification that will create a kingdom destined to last for 3,000 years. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, the south and the north, will be joined under a single crown, the double crown that symbolizes mastery over the entire length of the river. But this moment did not spring from nothing. Egypt's roots reach back into the pre-dynastic period, into the Naqada cultures that flourished between 4000 and 3000 BCE. And it is here, in this formative period, that archaeology reveals something fascinating. Egypt was not isolated. Far from it. The evidence is unmistakable. Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals appear in Egyptian tombs from the Naqada II period, around 3500 BCE. These small carved stones, when rolled across wet clay, leave distinctive impressions, signatures of ownership or authority. The technology and artistic motifs are clearly Mesopotamian in origin. Some are imports, carried hundreds of miles through trade networks. Others are local imitations, Egyptian craftsmen copying a foreign style. More evidence emerges from pottery. Spouted jars of distinctly Mesopotamian design begin appearing in Egyptian archaeological contexts during this same period. The famous Gebel el-Arak knife, found at Abydos and dated to around 3300 BCE, features imagery that is startlingly Mesopotamian in character, including a depiction of a figure identified as the Mesopotamian master of animals metaphor. The Narmer palette, one of ancient Egypt's most important artifacts, commemorating the unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE, shows the pharaoh wielding a mace. Not just any mace, but a pear-shaped mace of Mesopotamian design, replacing the traditional Egyptian disc-shaped mace head. Even in this moment of national triumph, foreign influence is literally carved into the stone. Recent genetic studies have added a stunning new dimension to this picture. In 2025, researchers analysing ancient DNA from an Egyptian skeleton dating to between 4495 and 4880 years ago discovered that approximately 1/5 of the genome showed clear links to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, the region encompassing Mesopotamia. 4/5 showed North African ancestry, but that 20% represents a significant genetic signature from the land of the Anunnaki. The scientific consensus is clear. There was extensive cultural exchange, trade, and likely migration between Mesopotamia and Egypt during Egypt's formative period. Ideas travelled, technologies travelled, people travelled, and with people come their stories, their gods, their understanding of the cosmos. This is not speculation. This is documented fact. The debate is not whether influence occurred, but the extent and nature of that influence. Mainstream historians argue for cultural borrowing for the natural diffusion of ideas through trade and diplomatic contact. Alternative theorists suggest something far more dramatic, that Egypt was not merely influenced by Mesopotamian culture, but that it was actively settled, perhaps even founded, by a migration of people or beings from that region, carrying with them not just trade goods but an entire cosmology. You walk now through the streets of an early dynastic Egyptian city, perhaps Memphis, the white-walled capital established by the legendary King Menes after unification. The city hums with activity. Scribes scratch hieroglyphs onto papyrus. Artisans shape copper tools. Priests prepare for the evening rituals at the temple. But as you observe the daily rhythms of Egyptian life, a pattern begins to emerge, a pattern that feels hauntingly familiar. The Egyptians believed their land was a gift from the gods, specifically from the Ennead, the 9 great deities of Heliopolis. At the beginning of time, there was only Nun, the primordial waters of chaos, dark and formless. From these waters rose the Benben, the primordial mound, and upon it stood Atum, the complete one, the self-created Shun. Alone in the void, Atum brought forth the first divine couple through his own essence, spitting out Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Shu and Tefnut gave birth to Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. These two were so enamoured with each other that they remained in constant embrace until their father Shu forcibly separated them, lifting Nut to form the arch of heaven, while Geb remained below as the earth. From the union of Geb and Nut came 4 siblings, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, the gods who would shape the human world. Does this structure sound familiar? A supreme sky deity, a separation of heaven and earth, divine siblings locked in conflict, the creation of humanity to serve the gods, a great flood sent to punish mankind. If you've been following this journey from the beginning, you'll recognise these as core elements of Mesopotamian mythology as well. In the Mesopotamian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, we find Tiamat, the primordial waters, and Apsu, the fresh water depths. We find younger gods born from the primordial pair, making so much noise that the elder gods plot to destroy them. We find Marduk, the young god who defeats Tiamat and splits her body to create heaven and earth. We find the Anunnaki Council deciding to create humanity from the blood of a slain god mixed with clay to serve as workers for the divine realm. The parallels are striking. Both cultures begin with watery chaos. Both feature a separation of heaven and earth. Both describe pantheons organised in hierarchies with supreme gods ruling over lesser deities. Both tell of humanity created to serve divine purposes. Both preserve stories of a catastrophic flood sent by angry gods to destroy mankind. Mainstream scholars explain these similarities through the lens of cultural diffusion and archetypal storytelling. Humans across cultures, they argue, naturally create similar narratives to explain universal experiences like creation, order versus chaos, life and death. Moreover, the documented trade and contact between Egypt and Mesopotamia in the pre-dynastic period provides a clear mechanism for story transmission. Merchants and travellers carry tales. Egyptian priests hear Mesopotamian myths and adapt them to fit their own theological framework. But alternative researchers ask a more provocative question. What if these aren't similar myths, but the same story told by different peoples? What if both the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians were describing actual historical events, actual beings, remembered differently across cultures but referring to a common source? What if the Anunnaki didn't just influence Egyptian religion, but were its foundation? To explore this possibility, we must look more closely at the gods themselves, not just at the broad mythological patterns, but at specific deities, their attributes, their domains, their personalities. We must ask whether individual Egyptian gods might be direct counterparts, descendants, or even the very same beings as specific members of the Anunnaki. Your attention is drawn to the temple rising before you, dedicated to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing and magic. He is one of Egypt's most beloved and mysterious deities. Unlike many gods who can be tied to specific cities or regions, Thoth's cult was widespread, his influence pervasive. He was called Jehuti in the ancient Egyptian language, meaning he who is like the ibis, that elegant wading bird with the curved beak that the Egyptians saw as a symbol of the crescent moon. Thoth was, above all, the god of knowledge. He invented writing hieroglyphs themselves. He was the scribe of the gods, recording their judgments and decrees. He was a master of mathematics, establishing the calendar and measuring time itself. He knew magic, the heka that bound the physical and spiritual realms. He was credited with writing numerous books of wisdom, most famously the legendary Book of Thoth, said to contain all the secrets of the universe. But Thoth was more than a scholar god. He was an intermediary, a diplomat between warring deities. In the Osiris myth, he provides Isis with the magical words to resurrect her murdered husband. In the conflict between Horus and Seth, he offers counsel and helps to restore order. He stands beside Ra, the sun god, on the solar bark as it travels through the underworld each night, helping to defeat the serpent Apophis. The Greeks, when they encountered Thoth, immediately recognized him. They identified him with their own Hermes, the messenger god, the guide of souls, the patron of travellers and merchants, and thieves. The fusion was so complete that Thoth became known as Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, and an entire philosophical and magical tradition, Hermeticism, arose from texts attributed to him. Now turn your gaze backward and eastward, to ancient Sumer, and meet Enki. He too was a god of wisdom and fresh water, dwelling in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean. He too was a master of magic and secret knowledge. He too was a creator god, the divine craftsman who shaped humanity. The Mesopotamian texts call him the god of intelligence, the clever one, the trickster who found solutions when other gods saw only problems. In the Atrahasis epic, when the lesser gods, the Agigi, rebel against the hard labour of digging rivers and canals, it is Enki who proposes the solution. Create a new being, a worker race, by mixing clay with the essence of a slain god. In the flood story, when Enlil decrees that humanity must be destroyed for their noise and chaos, it is Enki who defies the council and secretly warns Utnapishtim to build an ark. Again and again, Enki appears as humanity's protector and teacher, the god who gifts forbidden knowledge. The similarities between Thoth and Enki are remarkable. Both are gods of wisdom and knowledge. Both are associated with water, Enki with the freshwater Abzu, Thoth with the Nile. Both are credited with teaching humanity the essential arts of civilization. Both use their intelligence to solve problems that brute force cannot. Both have a swagal relationship with mankind, often acting as intermediaries or advocates. In mainstream comparative mythology, these parallels are explained as convergent development, two cultures independently creating similar deity types to fill similar roles. The wise god, the trickster, the teacher, these are common archetypes found in mythologies worldwide. But in alternative interpretations, particularly those following Sitchin's framework, the connection is more literal and more dramatic. Sitchin and his followers identify Thoth not as a parallel to Enki, but as Enki's son. In this telling, Thoth's original name was Ningishzida, a lesser Anunnaki deity who served as a scientist and architect under his father Enki's direction. When certain Anunnaki, including Ningishzida, were assigned to rule over Egypt, called Magan in the ancient texts, Ningishzida became known to the Egyptians by a new name, Jehuti, which the Greeks would later render as Thoth. This theory suggests that the Egyptian priesthood preserved genuine historical memory of this Anunnaki lineage. The ibis head was not mere symbolism, but represented either a mask or helmet worn by Ningishzida, or perhaps his association with wisdom and measurement, the ibis's curved beak mirroring mathematical arcs. The serpent symbolism often associated with Ningishzida in Mesopotamian sources, he was sometimes called the Great Serpent, finds its echo in Egyptian iconography where Thoth is connected to serpent imagery and to transformations. The implications of this identification are staggering. If Thoth was indeed Ningishzida, then Egypt's entire intellectual foundation, its writing system, its calendar, its mathematical and magical knowledge, was not independently developed, but was a direct transmission from the Anunnaki. Every hieroglyph carved into the temple walls, every calculation made by Egyptian astronomers, every ritual performed by Egyptian priests, would be the legacy of beings from beyond Earth, or at least from a civilization far more ancient than mainstream history acknowledges. Critics of this theory point to substantial problems. The name Ningishzida does not linguistically relate to Thoth or Jehuti in any traceable way. The serpent symbolism, while present, is applied to numerous deities in both cultures and doesn't constitute proof of identity. Most fundamentally, the entire framework rests on accepting Sitchin's controversial translations of Sumerian texts, translations that the professional Assyriologists and linguists largely reject. Nevertheless, the connections continue to accumulate, demanding explanation. The equation between Thoth and Enki, or Thoth and Ningishzida, remains one of the most compelling arguments for those who see the Egyptian pantheon as descended from or identical to the Anunnaki. But Thoth is not the only Egyptian deity whose profile matches an Anunnaki counterpart. As you walk through the Egyptian temple complex, you encounter other gods, each with their own domains, their own myths, their own possible connections to that older pantheon. There is Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, patron of craftsmen and architects. He is depicted as a man wrapped in a shroud holding a staff that combines the Ankh, symbol of life, the Djed pillar, symbol of stability, and the Wes scepter, symbol of power. Unlike other creator gods who brought forth the world through physical acts or biological generation, Ptah created through thought and speech. He conceived the world in his heart and brought it into being through his words. This concept of creation through divine speech is profoundly similar to the Memphite theology preserved on the Shabaka stone, one of Egypt's most philosophical religious texts. It states that Ptah is the mind and the tongue, the thought and the word that gives form to reality. Scholars have noted the similarity to the logos concept that would later appear in Greek philosophy and Christian theology, but the connection may be even older. In Mesopotamian tradition, it is Enki who possesses the me, the divine decrees or principles that structure reality. These me are sometimes described as physical objects, but are understood as the fundamental laws and technologies that make civilization possible. The gods who control the me control reality itself. The famous myth of Inanna and Enki tells how the goddess Inanna travels to Enki's city of Eridu, gets him drunk, and tricks him into giving her a large collection of the me, which she then brings to her own city of Uruk. Could Ptah's creation through thought and word be a philosophical evolution of this older Mesopotamian concept? Could the me have been transmitted to Egypt as an understanding of divine creative power, later theologized into Ptah's unique role as the god who speaks the world into existence? Alternative theorists go further, suggesting that Ptah might represent another Anunnaki figure entirely, perhaps Anu himself, the distant supreme god of heaven, or possibly an aspect of Enki in his role as master craftsman and creator. The title that Ptah holds, Lord of Magic and Maker of all things, certainly echoes the attributes of the Anunnaki creator gods. Then there is Osiris, perhaps Egypt's most important deity, the god of death, resurrection, and the afterlife. His story is one of tragedy and triumph. Osiris was a king beloved by his people, who taught them agriculture and civilization. His jealous brother Seth murdered him, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Osiris's wife and sister Isis searched tirelessly for the pieces, reassembled him through magic, and brought him back to life long enough to conceive a son, Horus. Osiris then descended to rule the underworld as judge of the dead, while Horus grew up to avenge his father and reclaim the throne. In Mesopotamian mythology, there are echoes of this narrative in the story of Dumuzi, also spelled Tammuz, a god associated with shepherds and vegetation, who dies and descends to the underworld. His wife, the goddess Inanna, journeys to the underworld to retrieve him, though the stories differ in their outcomes. The death and resurrection, or descent and return of a god associated with fertility and kingship, is a widespread motif in Near Eastern religion. But there are more specific connections. In some ancient texts, Osiris is called the Bull of the West, and is associated with the constellation we call Orion. The pyramids at Giza, according to the work of researchers like Robert Bovell, are aligned to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt, a correlation theory that remains debated but has captured popular imagination. The pyramid texts speak of the pharaoh's soul ascending to join Osiris in the sky, to become an eternal star. In Mesopotamian astronomy, the constellation we call Orion was associated with various divine figures, and the concept of the divine king ascending to join the gods in the heavens appears in Sumerian royal ideology as well. Could the worship of Osiris represent a continuation or evolution of earlier Mesopotamian star worship? Could Osiris himself be a title or role rather than a single being, adopted from an older tradition? Alternative researchers have even suggested that the Osiris myth contains encoded historical memory of conflicts between different Anunnaki factions. In this reading, Osiris represents one Anunnaki leader, Seth another, perhaps Enlil given his association with storms and chaos, and the murder and resurrection represent actual political struggles for control of Egyptian territory. The dismemberment of Osiris across Egypt could symbolize a division of land holdings or administrative zones. This interpretation requires accepting that the myths preserve not symbolic or allegorical truth, but historical events disguised in religious language. Critics point out that this approach fails to respect the sophistication of ancient theological thinking and reduces complex religious narratives to simplistic political allegories. Yet the persistence of such theories speaks to the undeniable power these myths hold, their suggestion of something concrete beneath the symbolic surface. Perhaps the most direct connection between Egyptian and Mesopotamian deities comes with the identification of Ra and Marduk. Ra, the sun god, was in many periods of Egyptian history the supreme deity. He was said to sail across the sky in his solar bark during the day, bringing light and life, then journey through the underworld at night, battling the chaos serpent Apophis to ensure the sun would rise again. Pharaohs called themselves sons of Ra, claiming divine right through solar descent. Marduk in Babylonian mythology rose to become the king of the gods after defeating the primordial chaos monster Tiamat. After his victory, he organized the cosmos, established the calendar, positioned the stars, and assigned the other gods their roles. He became associated with the planet Jupiter, the largest and most dominant celestial body after the sun and moon. In later periods, Marduk absorbed characteristics of other gods, becoming effectively a supreme deity in Babylonian religion. Both Ra and Marduk are solar gods, supreme rulers of pantheons, establishers of cosmic order, and defeaters of chaos. Both are associated with kingship and with the legitimacy of earthly rulers. Both have myths describing their daily or cyclical battles against forces of disorder. In Sitchin's interpretation, Marduk was Enki's firstborn son, ambitious and powerful, who eventually claimed supremacy over other Anunnaki and established himself as the principal god of Babylon. According to this theory, Marduk also sought control of Egypt, and the worship of Ra represents either Marduk himself under an Egyptian name or a rival Anunnaki figure competing with Marduk for supremacy. The ancient texts do record a complex relationship between Ra and other gods. At times, Ra and Atum are treated as aspects of the same deity, Ra-Atum. At other times, Ra is said to merge with Osiris in the underworld, becoming Osiris-Ra. This fluidity could reflect theological development over centuries, or it could, as alternative theorists suggest, preserve memory of different Anunnaki individuals who held power at different times, their identities blending in cultural memory. But perhaps no connection is more fascinating, more culturally significant, or more clearly documented than the relationship between the goddesses of love and war who dominated both civilizations. You find yourself drawn now to another temple, one dedicated to Hathor, the golden goddess, the lady of joy, the embodiment of feminine power in all its forms. Hathor. Even her name carries significance. Het-Hor, meaning house of Horus, suggesting she was the container, the mother, the very sky in which the falcon god flew. She is depicted most commonly as a woman with the horns of a cow framing a solar disk, sometimes as a cow herself, sometimes as a woman with cow's ears. Her temples were places of celebration, music, dance, and divine intoxication. She was the goddess of love, beauty, music, mining, fertility, and foreign lands. But Hathor was more than gentle. The myths tell of her transformation into Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, when Ra grew angry at humanity's rebellion. Hathor became the Eye of Ra, a fierce destroyer sent to punish mankind. She slaughtered humans with such enthusiasm that Ra himself grew alarmed and had to trick her with beer dyed red to look like blood. Hathor drank it, became intoxicated, transformed back to her benevolent form, and humanity was spared. The same goddess who brought love and joy could become the ultimate weapon of divine vengeance. Now shift your gaze eastward to Mesopotamia and meet Inanna, called Ishtar by the Akkadians and Babylonians. She too was a goddess of love, beauty, and sexuality. She too was associated with the planet Venus, the morning and evening star. But Inanna was also a goddess of war, a political power, of the storehouse where grain was kept. She was called the Queen of Heaven, and her cult was one of the most widespread and influential in all of Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh captures her dual nature perfectly. When she propositions the hero Gilgamesh and he rejects her, listing her previous lovers and their unfortunate fates, she responds not with sorrow but with rage. She demands from her father Anu, the Bull of Heaven, a cosmic weapon, and unleashes it upon Uruk to punish Gilgamesh for his refusal. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull, Inanna's fury contributes to the Divine Council's decision to punish them. But Inanna's most famous myth is her descent into the underworld, a journey to the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, she passes through 7 gates, removing an article of clothing or jewellery at each, arriving naked and powerless before her sister's throne. The judges of the dead strike her dead. Only through the intervention of Enki is she resurrected, though she must provide a substitute. Her husband Dumuzi is chosen, creating the cycle where he spends half the year in the underworld, his return marking the seasons of fertility. The parallels between Hathor and Inanna Ishtar are impossible to ignore. Both are goddesses of love and war, an unusual combination that speaks to the totality of feminine power. Both transform Hathor into Sekhmet, Inanna through her descent and resurrection. Both are associated with cattle, Hathor as a cow goddess, Inanna as the lady of the stall, protector of the storehouse. Both have connections to intoxication and altered states, Hathor through beer and wine, Inanna through the ecstatic rites of her temples. Both are fundamentally goddesses of life force itself, sexuality not as mere pleasure but as the creative power that generates existence. Both demand sacrifice, whether the blood of enemies in war or the devotion of lovers. Both have relationships with kingship, Hathor as the mother or consort of pharaohs, Inanna as the source of royal legitimacy through the sacred marriage rite, where kings symbolically united with her to ensure the land's fertility. Mainstream scholarship explains these similarities through the well-documented process of cultural syncretism. During the New Kingdom period, when Egypt's empire extended into the Levant and interacted intensively with Mesopotamian cultures, Egyptian religion absorbed foreign deities. Texts from this period explicitly mention Ishtar, called Ashtart in Egyptian sources, being worshipped in Egypt, particularly after the Assyrian conquest under Ashurbanipal in 66 BCE. The goddess Kudshu, a Syrian goddess of sacred sexuality, was incorporated into Egyptian worship and associated with Hathor. These are not theories but documented historical facts. The phenomenon worked in reverse as well. Egyptian religious concepts influenced the Levant. Hathor worship spread to Sinai, Byblos and other regions. The fluid exchange of religious ideas across the Bronze Age Near East is precisely what we would expect from interconnected civilizations engaged in trade, peace, diplomacy, and occasional conquest. But alternative theories see something more profound. If Hathor and Inanna represent the same archetype, might they represent the same being? In Sitchin's framework and in the theories of researchers who followed him, these goddesses might be different cultural interpretations of actual Anunnaki females. Some identify Inanna with a specific Anunnaki figure, possibly even suggesting she was Anunnaki royalty, perhaps the granddaughter of Enlil, known for her ambition and her conflicts with other members of the divine hierarchy. If Hathor emerged from the same source, perhaps through direct contact between Anunnaki assigned to different regions, then her temples in Egypt would preserve the worship of beings who had actually walked among humans, whose personalities, whose dual natures of love and war, were not symbolic but real. The sacred marriage rites, the temple prostitution that was part of Inanna's worship, might then represent not symbolic fertility magic but actual breeding programs, the Anunnaki maintaining hybrid bloodlines for purposes we can only speculate about. There's another fascinating element to consider: the relationship between Hathor and Isis. In Egyptian theology, these goddesses had distinct identities and roles, yet over time they merged and overlapped significantly. Isis, whose name might mean throne or seat, was originally the goddess queen, the devoted wife and sister of Osiris, the protective mother of Horus. But as her cult grew in power, particularly during the New Kingdom and into the Greco-Roman period, Isis absorbed the attributes of many other goddesses. By the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Isis had become a universal goddess, identified with Hathor so completely that they shared iconography, the cow horns and solar disk appearing on Isis as well. She had absorbed aspects of Mut, of Neith, becoming the mother of all gods, the lady of 10,000 names, the one who was all goddesses. Her cult spread across the Mediterranean, reaching Rome itself, where she was worshipped until Christianity finally displaced the old gods. And here's where the connections become even more intricate. Isis, like Inanna before her, had myths involving trickery and the acquisition of power. The story of how Isis obtained Ra's secret name parallels Inanna's myth of getting Enki drunk and stealing the me, the divine principles and technologies that govern civilization. Both goddesses used cunning to elevate their status. Both became supreme deities by acquiring knowledge or power that originally belonged to elder male gods. Could this recurring pattern point to actual historical events remembered through mythological frameworks? Were there power struggles among the Anunnaki leadership, with female members successfully challenging male supremacy, their victories preserved in the myths of goddesses who tricked or outmaneuvered the old gods? The iconography offers more clues. Hathor is often depicted holding sistrums, musical instruments used in her worship, and menet necklaces, symbols of fertility and rebirth. Inanna Ishtar is depicted with her 8-pointed star, with lions, and with weapons of war. When we look at artifacts from the Bronze Age Levant, we find curious hybrid imagery. Goddesses with Egyptian Hathor-style wigs holding Mesopotamian symbols, or wearing combinations of Egyptian and Mesopotamian regalia. The famous Kudshu plaque, now in the Winchester College collection, shows a naked goddess standing on a lion, holding snakes, wearing a Hathor wig, and identified in hieroglyphic inscriptions by multiple names: Kudshu, Anat Amars, and Astarte. This isn't confusion. This is a clear statement that the ancient peoples themselves recognized these goddesses as manifestations of the same divine feminine principle, the same power wearing different cultural masks. This brings us to a profound realization. Whether these goddesses were Anunnaki, whether they were evolved versions of earlier Mesopotamian deities adapted to Egyptian culture, or whether they were independent Egyptian goddesses later merged with foreign influences, the ancient peoples themselves clearly saw connections. They recognized that Hathor and Ishtar represented similar forces, similar aspects of divinity. They were comfortable worshipping foreign gods and seeing their own gods in foreign forms. This religious fluidity, this willingness to equate deities across cultures, suggests that the ancient worldview was more sophisticated than we often credit. They understood that names and forms were cultural expressions of deeper truths. Whether that deeper truth was the Anunnaki or the universal archetypes of the human psyche or the fundamental forces of nature personified, the result was the same, a recognition of connection across the ancient world. There's one more goddess we must discuss, one whose story may provide the most direct link between the Egyptian and Mesopotamian divine hierarchies. She is Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, the most fearsome female deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Sekhmet, as we mentioned, was the transformed aspect of Hathor, but she also had an independent identity as the Eye of Ra, the instrument of divine vengeance. Her name means she who is powerful, and her mythology is soaked in blood. When humanity rebelled against Ra's authority, he sent Sekhmet to punish them. She killed with such ferocity, drinking the blood of humans, that the earth turned red. Only Ra's intervention saved humanity from total extinction. The parallels to Inanna's descent story are striking. In that myth, Inanna descended to the underworld and was killed, creating crisis in the world above where fertility ceased and death reigned. In Sekhmet's myth, her unleashing created similar devastation. Both represent the dark side of feminine power, the destroyer aspect that balances the life-giver. Both had to be contained or placated, Sekhmet through intoxication, Inanna through resurrection and substitution. But there's more. In Mesopotamian mythology, there's a goddess who parallels Sekhmet even more directly. Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, Inanna's dark sister. Ereshkigal was not gentle. When Inanna arrived in her domain, Ereshkigal had her killed without mercy. Ereshkigal represented the inescapable power of death, the dark goddess who claimed all souls. In Egyptian mythology, this role was filled partly by Sekhmet in her destructive aspect, but also by lesser-known goddesses like Amit, the devourer of hearts. The pattern that emerges across both pantheons is the divine feminine that encompasses all aspects of existence. Birth, life, sexuality, joy, war, destruction, death, and rebirth. The goddesses are not one-dimensional. They contain multitudes. This theological sophistication appears in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, suggesting either parallel development of similar concepts, or, more likely given the documented contact, transmission and evolution of shared ideas. Alternative researchers have proposed specific identifications. Some suggest that Sekhmet and Ereshkigal might be the same Anunnaki individual, a fearsome female warrior or enforcer who earned divine status through her role in conflicts among the gods. Others propose that the various goddess forms, Hathor, Isis, Sekhmet in Egypt, Inanna, Ishtar, Ereshkigal in Mesopotamia, represent a smaller number of actual Anunnaki females, whose complex personalities and roles were fragmented into separate deities by human worshippers who couldn't comprehend the totality. This might explain the fluidity, the constant merging and separating of goddesses in both traditions. The Egyptians knew Hathor could become Sekhmet. They knew Isis absorbed Hathor. Perhaps they were preserving memory of shape-shifting or of individuals who held multiple roles, or of a smaller divine population than the vast pantheons suggest, with the same beings worshipped under different names in different contexts. From a psychological perspective, these goddesses represent the feminine archetype in all its complexity, refusing to be confined to the simple categories of mother, maiden, or crone, demanding recognition of women as complete beings capable of love and war, creation and destruction, nurturing and demanding sacrifice. Whether they were Anunnaki, cultural imports, or indigenous Egyptian goddesses, their worship represented a worldview where feminine power was acknowledged, honoured, and yes, feared. The temples of these goddesses were among the most important and wealthy in both civilizations. Hathor's temple at Dendera was one of Egypt's greatest cult centres. Inanna's temple at Uruk, the Inanna or House of Heaven, was the economic and religious heart of the city. These were not peripheral or private devotions. These goddesses were central to state religion, to royal ideology, to the functioning of civilization itself. If these goddesses were descendants of the Anunnaki, then their cults represent institutional memory of actual events, of real beings who demanded real service. If they were evolved Mesopotamian concepts adapted to Egypt, they represent the transmission of sophisticated theological ideas across cultures. If they were independent Egyptian deities later influenced by Mesopotamian counterparts, they represent humanity's consistent tendency to see the same truths and express them in locally flavoured forms. What we can say with certainty is that the goddess traditions of Egypt and Mesopotamia were deeply connected, that ancient peoples recognised these connections, and that the worship of feminine divine power was a shared characteristic of Near Eastern Bronze Age civilization. Whether that power originated with the Anunnaki or with the human imagination is the question that continues to drive research and speculation. One particularly intriguing aspect of Egyptian religion that may connect to Anunnaki theories is the concept of the divine pharaoh. From the earliest dynasties, Egyptian kings were not merely appointed by the gods, but were considered to be gods themselves, living incarnations of Horus, and upon death transformed into Osiris. This was not symbolic. The pharaoh was literally divine, a god walking among mortals. In Mesopotamia, kingship was also considered divine in origin. The king was chosen by the gods, sometimes described as semi-divine, or as having divine blood. The Sumerian king list famously states, "When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Kingship was a gift from the gods, not a purely human institution. But there's a key difference. Mesopotamian kings were servants of the gods, intermediaries, not gods themselves. Egyptian pharaohs were gods. This elevation might be explained through conventional historical development, the gradual apotheosis of rulers in an increasingly centralized state. Or it might, as alternative theories propose, reflect an actual biological difference. If the earliest pharaohs were literally descendants of the Anunnaki, if they carried Anunnaki genetic material through interbreeding between the gods and human women, then the claim of divine kingship would not be metaphor but fact. The Bible and other ancient Near Eastern texts always reference such unions. Genesis 6:2 states, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The offspring of these unions are called the Nephilim, often translated as giants or as the fallen ones. If such unions occurred, if they produced hybrid offspring with extended lifespans and enhanced capabilities, then the institution of divine kingship suddenly makes biological sense. Egyptian texts themselves speak of the gods mating with humans. In the New Kingdom, pharaohs promulgated the theology of divine birth, wherein the reigning god, often Amun-Ra, would visit the queen in the guise of her husband the king and conceive the royal heir. This ensured that each pharaoh was literally the son of a god. Mainstream historians view this as religious propaganda designed to legitimize royal power. Alternative theorists see it as garbled memory of actual Anunnaki human reproduction. The question of whether Egyptian gods were descendants of the Anunnaki cannot be answered without addressing the archaeological mystery that has captivated imaginations for centuries: the pyramids. Specifically, the question of how they were built and by whom, and what they tell us about the knowledge and capabilities of those who constructed them. The pyramids, specifically the question of how they were built and by whom, and what they tell us about the knowledge and capabilities of those who constructed them. This question becomes even more significant when we consider not just the famous pyramids of Giza, but the entire development of pyramid construction across Egypt's history, and what this progression might reveal about the transmission of knowledge from divine or ancestral sources. The evolution of pyramid building in Egypt provides a fascinating case study. The very first pyramid, the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, dated to around 2670 BCE, represents a revolutionary leap in architectural thinking. Before Djoser, Egyptian elites were buried in flat-topped rectangular structures called mastabas. Djoser's architect Imhotep, who would later be deified as a god of wisdom and medicine, had the inspired idea of stacking 6 progressively smaller mastabas to create the stepped pyramid. This innovation required not just architectural vision, but engineering knowledge, understanding of load-bearing, material properties, workforce management and resource logistics. What's remarkable is that Imhotep appears to have succeeded on his first attempt. There's no archaeological evidence of failed experimental pyramids before Djoser's. Either Imhotep was a singular genius who figured it all out through pure intellect, or he was working from existing knowledge, perhaps plans or principles transmitted from earlier sources. In the Anunnaki framework, Imhotep might have been initiated into secret knowledge preserved from the divine first time, taught by priests who maintained the architectural wisdom of the gods. In the Lost Civilization framework, he might have rediscovered or been taught principles that had survived from before the cataclysm. The next major development came with Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty and father of Khufu. Sneferu built not 1 but 3 pyramids, each representing experimental steps toward the true pyramid form. His first, the Medum pyramid, began as a step pyramid and was later filled in to create smooth sides. But it suffered a catastrophic structural failure, possibly even during construction, and stands today as a ruined tower surrounded by debris. You stand now at Giza before the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Even in your mind's eye, its scale is overwhelming. Originally rising 481 feet, made of approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, with some granite blocks in the king's chamber weighing up to 80 tons. Constructed, according to mainstream archaeology, over a period of about 20 years during the 4th dynasty, around 2560 BCE. The precision is astounding. The base of the pyramid forms an almost perfect square, with each side measuring about 230.4 metres, varying by less than 2 centimetres. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions within a tiny fraction of a degree. The blocks fit together, so tightly that in many places you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. And this was achieved by a civilization that, according to conventional history, had only copper tools, wooden sledges and hemp ropes. Mainstream Egyptology has proposed numerous theories for construction methods. The most widely accepted involves ramps, massive temporary structures of mud, brick and rubble that would have allowed workers to drag the stones up to increasing heights as the pyramid grew. Different ramp configurations have been suggested. Straight ramps extending out from one side, spiral ramps wrapping around the pyramid, or internal ramps built within the structure itself. Recent discoveries support this framework. In 2018, researchers found an ancient ramp at a quarry site at Hatnub in Egypt's eastern desert, with a slope steeper than previously thought possible, suggesting the Egyptians used more sophisticated ramp technology than earlier estimates allowed. Another study in 2024 proposed that a sophisticated water-based hydraulic system might have been used, particularly for the step pyramid of Djoser, with water pressure helping to lift stones from within the structure, volcanic style. A 2025 study found evidence that the Nile River had a now vanished branch that ran much closer to Giza than today, allowing workers to float stones via barge to within a short distance of the construction site. Experimental archaeology has shown that the methods proposed are physically possible. In the 90s, archaeologist Mark Lehner and stonemason Roger Hopkins built a small pyramid using ancient tools and techniques, demonstrating that copper tools, when constantly resharpened, could cut and shape limestone. Wet sand reduced friction for sledges. Organisation and manpower, not alien technology, could accomplish the task. Yet questions persist, even accounting for seasonal labour forces during the Nile's annual flood when farmers were idle. The logistics of coordinating tens of thousands of workers, maintaining food and water supplies, manufacturing and replacing tools, quarrying stones at multiple sites, transporting them, and placing them with such precision in just 20 years requires a level of social organisation and project management that some find difficult to attribute to a civilization only a few centuries removed from the Neolithic. This is where alternative theories enter. If the pyramids are far older than currently believed, if they were built not by Egyptians but by or with the help of an advanced precursor civilization, then the engineering problem changes. You're no longer trying to explain how Bronze Age people accomplished a seemingly impossible task. You're recognising that a much more sophisticated culture, perhaps the Anunnaki themselves, either built these structures or provided the knowledge and supervision for their construction. In Sitchin's framework and in the writings of researchers who followed him, the pyramids were not tombs at all, or at least not originally. They served technological functions. Some theories suggest they were power plants generating energy through internal chambers and passages. Others propose they were communication devices, beacons for incoming spacecraft. Still others suggest they were monumental markers, aligned with astronomical precision to encode knowledge for future generations. A specific claim in alternative literature is that Thoth and Enki was the architect of the Giza pyramids, that he designed them following the catastrophic flood as a way to preserve and transmit knowledge. The Sphinx, according to this interpretation, was carved in his honour, its original leonine form later recarved during dynastic Egypt, the alignment to Orion, the incorporation of the golden ratio and pi in the pyramid's dimensions, the potential astronomical alignments to other stars, all of this represents encoded information, a message in stone from the Anunnaki to future humanity. Mainstream Egyptologists forcefully reject these theories. They point out that we have no contemporary textual evidence from the Old Kingdom describing the pyramids as anything other than royal tombs. We have workers' villages at Giza where the labourers lived. We have administrative papyri describing food distribution and work assignments. We have graffiti inside the pyramids left by the work gangs, giving their team names. We have a clear developmental sequence from the mastaba tombs of earlier dynasties to Djoser's step pyramid, to the bent pyramid and red pyramid of Sneferu, showing Egyptian engineers experimenting and learning before successfully building the Great Pyramid. The alternative argument is that these later additions, the graffiti, the administrative records, represent not original construction but later renovation, reuse, or repurposing of structures built by an earlier civilization. The Giza pyramids, they argue, stand apart from the lesser pyramids built before and after, which show clear signs of inferior construction and understanding. It's as if Egyptian civilization reached a peak it never quite achieved again, a peak that alternative researchers attribute to Anunnaki involvement or to the preservation of pre-flood knowledge. The debate cannot be definitively settled without evidence that could shift the entire paradigm, such as discovering indisputable inscriptions inside sealed chambers of the Great Pyramid predating the 4th dynasty, or finding technological artefacts within the structure that could not have been produced with Bronze Age methods. Until such evidence emerges, each side interprets the same stones, the same archaeology through very different lenses. But the pyramid question, compelling as it is, returns us to the central inquiry. Whether the Anunnaki helped build them or not, did they leave their children as Egypt's gods? Yet before we can fully answer that question, we must confront another mystery, one that may provide the missing link between Mesopotamian origins and Egyptian civilization. We must look at what happened between the time when the Anunnaki supposedly ruled Mesopotamia and the time when Egyptian civilization suddenly flourished. We must examine the catastrophe that nearly destroyed everything. You find yourself standing at the edge of a frozen wasteland, though you know that beneath your feet lies what will one day become fertile farmland. The year is approximately 12 to 800 years before the present. You're at the tail end of the Pleistocene epoch, the last ice age. Massive glaciers still cover vast swathes of the northern hemisphere. But something is about to happen. Something that will change the world forever, and create a dividing line in human history so sharp that some researchers call it the Great Forgetting. This event is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and while it remains controversial in academic circles, the evidence for it has been steadily accumulating. The theory proposes that around 12,800 years ago, Earth encountered a swarm of cometary fragments, the remains of a giant comet that had broken apart in the inner solar system. Multiple impacts and airbursts occurred across North America, Europe, and possibly other regions. The immediate effects were devastating. Continental wildfires, megafauna extinctions, the rapid end of the Clovis culture in North America, but the long-term effects were even more dramatic. The impacts generated enough heat to partially melt the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America, sending massive pulses of fresh water into the Atlantic Ocean. This disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the great ocean conveyor belt that redistributes heat around the planet. The result was a sudden return to near-glacial conditions, a climate reversal so abrupt that temperatures in some regions dropped by 15 degrees Celsius within a decade. This cold snap, the Younger Dryas period, lasted for approximately 200 years before ending just as suddenly, with another period of rapid warming around 11,600 years ago. The archaeological and geological evidence supporting this hypothesis includes a widespread black mat layer found at sites across multiple continents, dated precisely to the onset of the Younger Dryas. Within this layer, researchers have found nanodiamonds, microscopic spherules of melted rock, iridium and platinum anomalies suggesting extraterrestrial input, and charcoal from continent-spanning wildfires. Above this layer, the megafauna are gone. Below it, they thrived. It's a clear demarcation line in the fossil record. Now, here's where this becomes relevant to our exploration of the Anunnaki and Egyptian gods. If a global cataclysm occurred around 12,800 years ago, severe enough to cause mass extinction and climate reversal, what happened to human civilization? Conventional archaeology tells us that humans at this time were hunter-gatherers with no cities, no writing, no agriculture. The standard model has the Neolithic revolution beginning around 10,000 years ago, with the gradual development of farming, followed thousands of years later by the first cities in Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. But what if this model is wrong? What if a sophisticated human civilization existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe? Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey challenge the conventional timeline. This massive temple complex, with its precisely carved megalithic pillars arranged in circles and decorated with sophisticated relief carvings of animals, has been dated to approximately 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. It predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates everything we thought necessary for such monumental architecture. The existence of Göbekli Tepe proves that humans were capable of large-scale coordinated projects, sophisticated symbolic thinking, and precise stonework far earlier than previously believed. But here's the question that haunts researchers. If people could build Göbekli Tepe immediately after the Younger Dryas ended, what were they capable of before it began? This is where the lost civilization hypothesis enters. Researchers like Graham Hancock have spent decades arguing that a sophisticated maritime civilization existed during the Ice Age, one that built its cities and harbours along coastlines that are now underwater, submerged by the sea level rise that accompanied the melting of the ice sheets. According to this theory, when the cataclysm struck, this civilization was largely destroyed, but survivors scattered, bringing their knowledge to different regions of the world where they became the teachers, the culture bringers, the civilizing heroes remembered in global mythology. These survivors would have taught the surviving hunter-gatherers of various regions the basics of astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, and monumental architecture. In Mesopotamia, they established the Sumerian civilization and became the Anunnaki, the princely offspring, remembered as gods who descended from heaven because they came from across the seas from a lost homeland. In Egypt, they did the same, establishing the pre-dynastic cultures and becoming the divine first rulers of the Zep Tepi, the first time. This theory elegantly explains several mysteries. It explains why the Anunnaki and Egyptian gods share so many characteristics. They are describing the same group of survivors, remembered differently by populations that diverged over millennia. It explains why both civilizations seem to appear with surprising sophistication, writing and complex social organization emerging remarkably quickly by archaeological standards. They weren't starting from zero. They were rebuilding, relearning, rediscovering what had been lost. It explains the global flood myths. If you've experienced the Younger Dryas catastrophe, with its impacts, megafloods from glacial melt and rising sea levels, you would preserve stories of a time when the world was destroyed by water and fire. The biblical flood, the Mesopotamian deluge story of Utnapishtim, the Greek myth of Deucalion, the Hindu story of Manu. These aren't independent inventions, they're cultural memories of the same real event. The theory even provides context for the seemingly impossible astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over a 25-20-year cycle, appears to be referenced in ancient mythology and in the alignments of structures like the Giza pyramids. If civilization is only 6,000 years old, observing and calculating precession would be nearly impossible. But if the builders or the knowledge they inherited came from a much older civilization that had been observing the stars for tens of thousands of years, it suddenly makes sense. Critics of this theory point out that we have no undisputed ruins from this supposed Ice Age civilization. No cities have been found on the continental shelves. No artifacts have been recovered that demonstrate advanced technology from before 10,000 BCE. The sites we have, like Göbekli Tepe, while impressive, don't require lost super technology. They are well within the capabilities of organised hunter-gatherer societies with motivation and time. Furthermore, the genetic evidence doesn't support a bottleneck event at the Younger Dryas, corresponding to near extinction. Human populations do show bottlenecks, but they're earlier, around 70,000 years ago, possibly from the Toba supervolcano eruption. By the Younger Dryas, humans were widely distributed across the globe, and while regional populations certainly suffered, there's no genetic signature of global near extinction. However, and this is crucial, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We have explored only a tiny fraction of the ocean floor. Ancient coastlines lie under hundreds of feet of water and thousands of years of sediment. Moreover, if this civilization used primarily organic materials, wood and plant fibres for most construction, very little would survive 10 millennia of decay. Only the most massive stone structures would remain, and we may not yet have found them or may not recognise them as artificial. The truth likely lies somewhere between the extremes. There probably wasn't a global super-civilization with electricity and aircraft before the Younger Dryas, but were there sophisticated maritime cultures, perhaps with some level of monumental building capability, some astronomical knowledge, some organised social complexity that were destroyed by the catastrophe? That's increasingly looking possible. And if such cultures existed, if their survivors did indeed become the founding figures of Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization, then the gods of both cultures might indeed be descendants or memories of these ancestral teachers. Not aliens, not Anunnaki from another planet, but humans from another time, from a forgotten chapter of our own history, remembered and eventually deified by the cultures they helped rebuild. This framework allows us to accept the basic structure of the Anunnaki-Egyptian god connection while rejecting the extraterrestrial elements. The Anunnaki were the elite survivors of a pre-catastrophe culture who established themselves as rulers and teachers in Mesopotamia. Their children and grandchildren literally, or in terms of transmitted cultural knowledge, continued their work. Some migrated to or maintained contact with Egypt, establishing the pre-dynastic cultures. The Egyptian gods, the divine rulers of the first time, were their descendants, carrying forward the knowledge and claiming divine status based on their inheritance from the antediluvian ancestors. The genetic evidence of Mesopotamian ancestry in ancient Egyptians fits this model. So does the archaeological evidence of cultural transmission during the pre-dynastic period. So does the mythological evidence of shared creation stories and flood narratives. It doesn't require believing in ancient astronauts, but it does require accepting that human civilization might be older and more complex than conventional archaeology acknowledges. There's one more piece of evidence that supports this reconstructed timeline. The Egyptian concept of the Zep Tepi, the first time, doesn't just mean the era when gods ruled. It specifically refers to a golden age of order and wisdom that preceded the historical period. Egyptian texts speak of this time with reverence, as an ideal to which they wish to return. The knowledge of the Zep Tepi was preserved by priestly schools, passed down through carefully guarded lineages, forming what was essentially a secret tradition within Egyptian religion. This pattern of hidden knowledge, of elite priesthoods guarding the secrets of the ancestors, appears in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. The priests of both civilizations weren't just performing rituals, they were astronomers, mathematicians, architects, physicians. They preserved technical knowledge alongside religious doctrine. If this knowledge originated with survivors of an earlier civilization, it makes sense that it would be carefully controlled, passed only to the initiated, treated as sacred inheritance from the Sens. The mystery schools of ancient Egypt, the most famous being the school at Heliopolis dedicated to Re-Atum, taught initiates over many years, gradually revealing secrets of mathematics, geometry, medicine, and spiritual practice. Similar schools existed in Mesopotamia. Were these schools preserving fragments of pre-catastrophe knowledge? Were they teaching not new discoveries but rediscoveries, the salvaged wisdom of the Zep Tepi? If so, then when we look at the stunning achievements of Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilization, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the mathematical sophistication, the astronomical knowledge, we're not looking at primitive people suddenly becoming advanced. We're looking at civilization recovering, climbing back up from a devastating setback, relearning what had been known before the world was destroyed and rebuilt. And in this framework, the question of whether Egyptian gods were descendants of the Anunnaki has a clear answer: yes. Not because they were literal children of extraterrestrial beings, but because they were the continuation of the same cultural lineage, the same transmission of knowledge and authority from the survivors who became the divine founders of both civilizations. They were all descendants, culturally and perhaps genetically, of whoever the Anunnaki really were, the survivors of the catastrophe, the teachers of the New World, the gods who walked among humans in that golden time before history began. To answer this question most directly, we must look at what the ancient Egyptians themselves said about their gods' origins. Egyptian mythology contains a concept that is crucial and often overlooked: the idea that the gods once walked the earth as physical kings before ascending to rule from the spiritual realm. According to Egyptian tradition, before the human pharaohs, Egypt was ruled by the gods themselves during a golden age called Zep Tepi, the first time. During this primordial age, the gods were not distant cosmic forces, but physical rulers who established the principles of Ma'at, order and justice, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, and who ruled from physical palaces. Eventually, they ascended, leaving behind semi-divine successors and then purely human kings, though these human kings retained divine blood through descent. This tradition is preserved in the Turin King List, an ancient papyrus dating to the reign of Ramesses II. Before listing the human pharaohs, it records the reigns of the gods and spirits who ruled Egypt before them. The papyrus is fragmentary, but the surviving portions clearly distinguish between divine rulers and mortal ones. This Egyptian concept closely parallels the Sumerian King List, which similarly records impossibly long reigns for kings who ruled before the Great Flood, then progressively more realistic reign lengths for post-flood kings. The Sumerian list states explicitly, when kingship descended from heaven, implying that the first kings were not human but divine or semi-divine. Both civilizations preserve traditions of a time when gods ruled physically on earth. Both record a transition from divine to human kingship. Both attribute the foundation of civilization to these divine first rulers. If both are describing the same historical reality, if the Anunnaki did establish themselves as rulers over early human settlements in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, then the later gods of Egypt, the Ennead and the rest of the Egyptian pantheon, would indeed be the descendants, the second and third generation Anunnaki, who continued to rule or oversee Egyptian civilization. But there's another possibility, one that doesn't require believing in ancient astronauts at all. What if the connection between Egyptian and Mesopotamian gods reflects human migration and the transmission of religious ideas during a crucial formative period? Recall the genetic evidence. 20% of that ancient Egyptian genome showed Mesopotamian ancestry. Recall the archaeological evidence. Mesopotamian artifacts, technologies, artistic motifs appearing in pre-dynastic Egypt. Recall the historical reality of the Bronze Age Near East, a world connected by trade routes, by diplomatic embassies, by the movement of peoples during times of drought, famine, and conflict. What if during the late 4th millennium BC a wave of migration brought people from the collapsing or transforming Mesopotamian city-states to the Nile Valley? These migrants would have brought their culture, their technologies and their gods. Settling among the indigenous Nile Valley peoples, they would have intermarried, merged traditions, and over generations created a new hybrid culture that became dynastic Egypt. In this scenario, the Egyptian gods are descendants of the Anunnaki not because they are literal offspring of extraterrestrial beings, but because they are the evolved, adapted versions of Mesopotamian deities as remembered and worshipped by a migrant population that became Egyptian. Enki becomes Thoth, Inanna becomes Hathor or Isis. The divine kings remembered in Mesopotamia become the divine pharaohs of Egypt. The myths transform, but the core structure remains. This is a more prosaic explanation than alien visitation, but it is no less profound. It suggests that Egyptian civilization, magnificent as it was, did not spring fully formed from the Nile mud. It was built on foundations laid elsewhere, its brilliance partly derivative yet ultimately transcendent, taking borrowed materials and fashioning from them something entirely new and uniquely Egyptian. There is a third possibility, one that bridges the gap between the ancient astronaut interpretation and the cultural diffusion model. What if the truth is more complex than either extreme? Consider this scenario. An advanced human civilization existed during the last ice age, a civilization now lost to history because it was destroyed by the cataclysms that marked the transition to our current climate period around 11,600 years ago. This civilization, whether we call it Atlantis or give it another name or leave it unnamed, developed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and perhaps technologies we have yet to rediscover. When global catastrophe struck, when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose dramatically, when coastlines were inundated and entire landscapes transformed, this civilization was largely destroyed. But survivors scattered, carrying with them fragments of the old knowledge. Some went to Mesopotamia, establishing the first city-states along the Tigris and Euphrates, teaching the indigenous peoples agriculture and writing and architecture. Others went to Egypt, performing the same role along the Nile. Still others went to other regions, India, China, the Americas, establishing pockets of advanced culture that native peoples would remember as the time when the gods walked among them. These survivors, these teachers, would have seemed godlike to Neolithic peoples. They had knowledge that appeared miraculous. They could predict celestial events, build with precision, heal diseases, preserve information across time. Their descendants, gradually intermarrying with local populations, would have formed a priestly or noble class, claiming divine ancestry because their lineage genuinely did trace back to this lost advanced people. The Anunnaki, in this interpretation, were not aliens but the elites of a precursor civilization. The Egyptian gods were their literal descendants, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren carrying the blood and knowledge of those first teachers. As the generations passed and the pure lineages diluted, as the old knowledge was partially forgotten or hoarded by secret societies, the memory transformed from history into mythology. This theory, often called the lost civilization hypothesis, or the Atlantis hypothesis, has its own challenges. Where is the archaeological evidence of this Ice Age civilization? If they were so advanced, where are their cities, their tools, their writing? The standard answer is that they built on coastlines, now drowned under hundreds of feet of ocean, that their records were on materials that degraded over millennia, that only megalithic stone structures like Göbekli, Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, remain as cryptic hints of their existence. Academic archaeology generally rejects this hypothesis for lack of positive evidence, though some researchers like Graham Hancock continue to argue for it compellingly. But it would explain the deep mythological connections between Egypt and Mesopotamia without requiring extraterrestrials, while still accounting for the seemingly impossible knowledge and accomplishments attributed to gods in both traditions. So where does this leave us? Are the Egyptian gods the descendants of the Anunnaki? If by Anunnaki we mean extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru, who genetically engineered humanity, the answer depends entirely on whether you accept Sitchin's translations and interpretations of ancient texts, which mainstream scholarship does not. The parallels between Thoth and Enki, between Ra and Marduk, between the creation myths and flood stories are striking but can be explained through cultural diffusion. If by Anunnaki we mean the supreme deities of Mesopotamian religion, then yes, in a meaningful sense, Egyptian gods were influenced by and may represent evolved versions of Mesopotamian deities, transmitted during the crucial pre-dynastic period when the two cultures were in active contact. The DNA evidence confirms migration. The archaeological evidence confirms cultural exchange. The mythological parallels are undeniable. If by Anunnaki we mean the survivors of a lost advanced civilization who served as the teachers and founding figures of both Mesopotamian and Egyptian culture, then Egyptian gods could indeed be their descendants, genealogically and culturally, though this remains speculative in the absence of definitive proof of such a precursor civilization. The truth, as is so often the case, likely contains elements from multiple explanations. Egypt was influenced by Mesopotamia during its formative period. Myths and religious concepts travelled along trade routes, but Egypt was also innovating, synthesizing these influences with indigenous African traditions and its own unique geographic and cultural situation to produce something that was distinctly and magnificently Egyptian. The Egyptian gods, whether they were descendants of alien Anunnaki, or evolved versions of Mesopotamian deities or entirely indigenous African gods later influenced by Near Eastern concepts, served the same function. They provided a framework for understanding the cosmos. They embodied the principles that governed existence. They offered a connection between the human and the divine. They gave meaning to life and death and the journey between. Perhaps that is the deepest truth here. The hunger to connect Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions, the desire to see the Anunnaki in the Egyptian pantheon, reflects something profound in human nature. We sense continuity in our spiritual history. We recognize patterns across cultures. We know somehow that we are all part of a larger human story, that the gods our ancestors worshipped, whatever their origin, represented humanity's best attempts to reach toward the transcendent. Whether Thoth was Ningishzida, or an Egyptian god inspired by Mesopotamian myths, or a wholly original deity, he still represents the quest for wisdom. Whether the pyramids were built by Anunnaki scientists or Egyptian engineers, or a collaboration between advanced precursor peoples and Nile Valley civilizations, they still stand as monuments to human aspiration and capability. Whether the pharaohs carried Anunnaki DNA or claimed divine ancestry as political theatre, they still created a civilization that lasted 3,000 years and has fascinated every generation since. You stand once more at the edge of the Sahara, but now the sun is setting, painting the pyramids in shades of gold and crimson. The Nile reflects the dying light like a river of bronze. You have journeyed across millennia, across continents, through myths and genetics and archaeological strata. You have asked whether Egypt's gods were children of the Anunnaki. The answer, frustratingly and beautifully, is that we don't know with certainty, but we know there were connections documented and undeniable. We know the ancient world was far more interconnected than we often imagine. We know that Egypt did not arise in isolation, but as part of a broader Near Eastern cultural complex where ideas flowed like water through human populations hungry for meaning and explanation. We know that the questions themselves are valuable, that asking how civilizations influenced each other, how myths transformed as they crossed borders, how gods might represent historical figures or natural forces, or transcendent truths, these questions drive us deeper into understanding both our ancestors and ourselves. Perhaps the Egyptian gods were descendants of the Anunnaki, in the way that all later mythologies are descendants of earlier ones, carrying forward the eternal human project of naming the sacred, of populating the heavens with faces and stories, of creating bridges between the mortal and the infinite. And perhaps that is enough. Not certainty, but connection. Not proof, but possibility. Not a single answer, but an invitation to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep standing beneath the stars that our ancestors watched and wondered about, asking the same questions they asked. Who are we? Where did we come from? And what lies beyond? The pyramids don't answer. They simply endure. And in their endurance, in the endurance of the myths and the gods and the questions themselves, we find something more valuable than certainty. We find continuity. We find that we are part of a story that stretches back before memory and forward beyond sight. We find that the search itself is sacred. So whether you believe the Egyptian gods were literal descendants of alien Anunnaki, or evolved forms of Mesopotamian deities, or indigenous creations with borrowed elements, or something else entirely, what matters is that you're asking. You're looking at the old stones and the older stories and refusing to accept that everything has been explained. You're honouring the mystery while pursuing the truth, and that is perhaps the most divine act of all. That is the legacy the gods, whoever and whatever they were, have left us. The imperative to seek, to question, to wonder. The night falls fully now. Above Giza, the stars emerge, the same stars that watched the pyramids being built. The same stars the Anunnaki observed from their ziggurats in Sumer. And in that eternal sky, the boundaries between cultures dissolve. Egyptian and Mesopotamian, human and divine, past and present, all become part of one continuous story written in stone and star, in myth and memory, in the endless human quest to understand our place in a cosmos vast beyond imagining. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient mysteries and possible connections. If you found this exploration meaningful, perhaps a gentle like and subscribe to the channel would be a wonderful way to support us. I'd appreciate your kind support if you kindly let us know where we can improve or do better. Please do let us know in the comments. For more videos like these, please do check out our latest videos as well. Till then, see you in the next one.